Okay. What did he say?
Welcome to everybody. It's a great day to be a Kiwanian. Kids need Kiwanis, and we need you. Let's repeat our defining statement all together. Kiwanis is a global organization of volunteers dedicated to serving one child and one community at a time. Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Clay, do we have a song?
We certainly do. It's called America the Beautiful, and it starts out, "Oh, beautiful for spacious skies. Oh, beautiful for
spacious skies, for amber waves of rain, for her mountains' majesty, above the fruited plain. America, America, God shed his grace on thee, and crown thy good with brotherhood, from sea to shining sea." All right. Do we have an invocation? This is one thing I did not find out.
Let's pray. Father, we thank you for this food, our health, and our homes. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. We want to recognize two guests that we have. Lee Parker, would you like to introduce your guest?
Yes, I have a guest. With me today is a friend, Robert Courts. I literally ran into him a few weeks ago in our cars. We've become friends since then. He's a local do-gooder around town, and he helps a lot of folks locally with businesses, and would love for him to get to know our club better, and for you to get to know him. Please welcome Robert Courts.
And Mel Broughton, you have a guest.
Fellow Kiwanians, I'm pleased to have my brother Jimmy. Some of you all may remember about 12 plus years ago, Jimmy talked about his time in Washington, D.C. Jimmy and his family live in Winston-Salem, and he works for Wake Forest University and Baptist Medical. Jimmy Broughton.
Membership welfare. Do we have anyone that would like to report on membership welfare? Birthdays. I'm going to let somebody tell me the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Last right side, Sam Carruthers, Travis Leisure, Mike Unland, Cricket Harrell, Hugh Stevens.
We have some announcements. Scott, you already have a microphone. Would you like to make your announcement?
Yeah, this is the food drive. I was sitting here enjoying my banana pudding and thinking, we take so much for granted, but there are a bunch of people that do have food insecurity. And we're doing our food drive here. Cooper started us off with $1,000, and thank you, Robert. Since then, we've gotten in checks.
Yes.
Last week, we passed the bucket, and we got $228 cash. We had $2,300 in checks, including Robert's, so it was Robert's plus $1,300. And today I've been handed checks for $225, and I've gotten notice that there was a $250 direct payment on one of our club members to our ministries. Our total is $2,775 to help people that don't have food on a daily basis, as us fat cats have. So keep in mind, anybody wants to give some more, we have to take it. Last year, I was told $7,000. So
Okay.
for comparison, where are we, Robert?
Yeah, we're way behind, so.
Thank you.
Courtney?
Speaking of money, I've had some questions, and they're very, very good questions about your bill this quarter in July jumping up so high. So if you notice your bill, if you're a senior member, instead of being $25, it's $167. And for active members, instead of being $135, it's $277. I just wanted to remind everybody that when we passed our budget revisions, that included an annual charge for Kiwanis International and district dues. So instead of adding that on to your quarterly bill throughout the year, which would have, bumped your quarterly dues up to about 160 something, it was voted upon by the membership to just do it annually. So it's a 142 charge that will occur, or if it might go up, but depending on Kiwanis International, but right now it's 142 annually every July. So I just wanted to make sure that you get clarified. But if you have any questions about it, just let me know. Just email me or call me, but thanks.
Thank you, Courtney. And Jason?
Just a real quick update on our pancake breakfast efforts. They're going very well. We've had a lot of people come forward even today with sponsorships. So we're in the sponsorship portion of our pancake breakfast efforts. Again, that date is October 19th here. And we have sign-up sheets on the back. You can see the balloons if you want to engage and help. Courtney is leading the volunteer efforts, but I will be sending out letters to those who have agreed to sponsor us this week. So thank you so much.
Thank you for all you're doing. Thank you. And now I'm going to tell you a little bit about our speaker, Rich Leonard. He's currently the Dean of the Law School at Campbell University. He's been a pioneering judge, a groundbreaking court administrator, a restorer of historic courthouses, and at age 29, the youngest U.S. District Court Clerk in the country, which gave him a front row seat to some of the most sensational trials in North Carolina history, as you can imagine. He's also run marathons, he's climbed mountains, he's forged cross-continental friendships, and embraced life in all its majesty and messiness, according to his words. He worked as a special consultant to the U.S. Department of State, where for 20 years he helped developing countries in sub-Saharan Africa create workable court systems. He is here today to share his most recently published book. It's called Welcome to Windhoek, A Judge's Journey. Let's welcome our speaker, Rich Leonard.
Well, good afternoon all, and what a treat to be here and to see so many old friends in this audience. And I am going to talk about my book, but as I'm starting my 12th year as the Dean at Campbell Law, it would be deaconal malpractice not to talk a little bit about my law school first. So I'm going to do that. The average law school dean now lasts 3.1 years. That's the median. These are not easy jobs. They're exhilarating jobs, but they're not easy. So I find myself the longest tenured law dean in North Carolina, the 10th longest tenured in the nation out of 204, and I persevere. I do that because I'm so proud of where the school has come, and I'm even prouder of its future trajectory. I just seated 192 new 1L students last Friday. It is the best credential class I've ever seated. We had more applications than we've ever had. We had 1,150 applications for those 192 spots. We are large. We're not the little Campbell that many of you may hold in the back of your mind. We have 542 students enrolled this fall. We are almost precisely the same size as Carolina to be the second largest law school in the state behind Duke. And Duke's really in southern New Jersey. They just happen to have a campus in Durham. We continue to excel in the things we always have. I just certified a bar pass rate of 96%, an employment rate of 90%, 10 months after graduation. And we have enormous impact in our state because a much higher percentage of my graduates stay in our state than many of the other law schools. We have more judges, more district attorneys, more prosecutors, more public defenders by far than any other law school. There's some things we do really well. We are an advocacy law school. You can't get out of Campbell without taking a 4-credit trial advocacy class. I always say you may never try another case, but you tried one to graduate from Campbell. We call it the cadaver of law school. And our competitive advocacy program is on steroids. The year before I came, we sent 2 teams into competitions. Last year, I sent more than 40. 4 different ranking sources have said that we are among the top 10 advocacy schools in the country. I'm a huge believer in experiential education. I've started 5 clinics since I got to Campbell. I inherited 1. I think my job is to keep the balance between the most rigorous doctrinal curriculum in the state and maybe the nation, but also the opportunity for my students in law school to get out there and do it. So excited about that, and a couple more on the horizon for next year. And of all things, Campbell has gone international. I had 55 students studying abroad this summer. I have a summer program in Cambridge. I have a summer program in St. Andrews, and I have a summer program in Ghana. Why Ghana? That's going to bring me to the book, because Africa is a place that is dear to my heart. It's a place I have visited more than 70 times in the last 30 years, doing incredible work there with remarkable people. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. Now, my wife always says I talk too long and I read too much. So I'm going to try not to do that today. But let me just start out with how this all came about. I was sitting in my chair, and by the way, most of you may know this, but I was a federal bankruptcy judge for 2 decades before I was a dean. That will make the first sentence make some sense to you. I was sitting in my chambers in my small courthouse in Wilson, North Carolina, one spring afternoon in 1994 when my phone rang. The caller said he was from the U.S. State Department and asked if I would consider going to Zambia as a consultant. I didn't hesitate. Sure, where the hell is Zambia? He explained the where, what, and why behind the request. The Zambian people had recently adopted a new constitution modeled in many ways after ours. They wanted some American judges to help set up their new structure. We agreed to talk again the next day. I thought he might be a quack or that nothing would come of it. But just in case, I did some preliminary research that evening. When he called back, I said, "You've got the wrong guy. I am a tall, blonde, white Southerner with a considerable accent. Zambia is a 100% Black African nation. I don't think I will be effective." He disagreed. He said they'd been looking for recommendations from a number of sources and that my name had come up repeatedly. The Zambians wanted a judge with administrative experience, and early in my career, I was the clerk of the local federal district court. He asked if I would at least participate in a transatlantic phone call the next day. The call did not go well, or so I thought. On the line from Zambia was the senior civil servant tasked with setting up the new structure. She spoke beautiful British English with an African accent, but the quality of the call was poor. I understood about every 3rd word. Even so, I responded as best I could to what I thought she was saying. Afterward, I called my handler. The call was a disaster. I'm sorry I embarrassed you. Quite the contrary, he responded. You got the job. A few days before I was to depart, my handler asked about my travel plans. I was surprised he didn't know. But one thing I would later learn through years of traveling abroad was that not every branch of the State Department is always in sync. I told him his travel office had me flying to London and then taking Air Zambia to the capital of Lusaka. he exploded. Those idiots. You can't fly Air Zambia. The airline is in debt to creditors all over the world. Every time one of their planes touches down, the creditors try to seize it and they just take off. Now, as a federal bankruptcy judge, I appreciated the finer points of debt, attachment, and property seizure. So I asked to be rebooked. My new ticket took me through South Africa, safe from the grasping clutches of creditors. I went to bed feeling relieved. But on the morning of my departure, listening to NPR in the shower, I received a bigger jolt. I heard that the international arrival terminal at Jan Smuts Airport in Johannesburg, the airport where I was landing the next day, had just been bombed. I called my handler and said, "Does this put a kink in my plans?" He assured me everything would be fine. And though I did transit through an open-air tent hastily constructed as a makeshift terminal beside the still smoking ruins of the terminal, he turned out to be right, and I passed through Johannesburg without incident. Okay, now what I want to do now is introduce you to three remarkable people, because one of the things that took me back to Africa over and over again were the judges that I met and worked with there, and how seriously they took their jobs, and how hard they labored under conditions we could only imagine. So let me tell you about my first one. My first day in Lusaka started with a meeting with the Chief Justice, Matthew Ngulubi, an amiable and gregarious guy who would become a close friend. We met in his office. What caught my eye were the three telephones on his desk. When one rang, he would pick up each in succession until he found the right one. This was because there were three distinct and disconnected phone systems, one built by the Japanese, one by the Scandinavians, and one by the Americans. One worked internationally, one within Zambia, and the other only locally. I came to see this as a metaphor for all of Africa. Uncoordinated aid, which the Africans gratefully accepted, came from all quarters. The effects were confusing and duplicative. Once we knew each other better, Chief Justice Ngulubi told me a story. Early in his term, he said, he handed down a judgment in an election case unfavorable to the government. Later that night, the president's private security detail showed up at his residence and asked him to accompany them to State House. He was ushered into President Kaunda's office. After a few minutes of pleasantries, the president expressed his unhappiness with the judgment and asked the Chief Justice to rescind it. The justice replied, "Mr. President, we are now a constitutional democracy, and we each have our roles. I have performed mine. I assume you will do likewise." As he got up to depart, he thought he had a 50-50 chance of being allowed to leave, but he was. But years later, I was heartsick to read that he was embroiled in scandal. A secret Swiss bank account had been discovered in his name. Although professing his innocence, he resigned in disgrace. And then later, a commission of inquiry believed his story, that he had absolutely no knowledge of the bank account, but that it had been set up by President Kaunda as leverage against him if he issued unpopular judgments. He never returned to the court, but he stays a leading member of the Zambian legal community. My second judge. The basic trial court in Zambia is the High Court, as in Great Britain. The High Court in Lusaka consisted of 8 judges, 5 men and 3 women. The judge in charge, a term I love, called the allocation judge, was Irene Mambalima. She became one of my favorite judicial colleagues. With the stature of a traditional African woman and often wearing a native headscarf, Judge Mambalima was easy to underestimate. But watching her pillory lawyers in her courtroom, I quickly saw she had put her legal training at the University of London to good use. At our initial meeting, she shared her frustration at the lack of case management. She had no idea how many cases were in her court, how many were assigned to each judge, or the procedural posture of each. A better system was desperately needed. This was music to my ears. I love systems, always have. One of my first tasks as the clerk of a federal district court was to devise an elaborate case management system basically from scratch. In 3 years, my court rose from near the bottom in the country in case dispositions to number 1. Why not try that in Lusaka? And so I set to work. I drew a random sample of the caseload. I charted each case along several parameters to learn what was actually happening. The results were startling. Hundreds of cases had languished for years with no attention, no action, no monitoring, no accountability. I discussed the results with Judge Mambalima and her 2 female colleagues over tea one morning. Do you 3 realize that you're doing 80% of the work of this court? They shrugged. Rich, this is Africa, said Judge Mambalima. Men talk, women work. By the way, she later became the Chief Justice of Zambia and died sadly and prematurely last summer, so I lost a very good friend. And then my 3rd judge. After Zambia, I thought I was done with Africa. We had several projects. We brought them to conclusion. It was a logical end, and I came home. But it turned out the Chief Justice of Zambia bragged to the Chief Justice of Tanzania about all the cool stuff we had done. So the next thing I knew, I was getting invitations to come to Dar es Salaam and work with the High Court there. So the person that I want to tell you about is Francis Nialali, who may be the wisest man I've ever known, except possibly Frank Dupree, and I'll get to that. Chief Justice Nialali, who had served for years under the most trying of circumstances, was a true citizen of the world and fascinated by computers. He was convinced that automation was the answer to his backlog. At his request, the World Bank bought the court a room full of computers. A team of German programmers who weren't lawyers and knew nothing about common law courts had come before me to work on a case management system with the Tanzanians, who in turn had never seen a computer and had no idea why they were being asked all these questions. The programmers were trained to keep asking questions, and the Tanzanians, by nature, continued to answer politely. The result was total garbage. As an example, they had identified 40 different ways a civil case could terminate in Tanzania, most of them just synonyms with no legal meaning. The last was death by hanging, just to be sure all bases were covered. We immediately cut the number of case conclusions to 9, each represented by a numerical code. One of the programs we developed in Tanzania was a simple piece of scheduling software showing the trial calendars for all of the high court judges. The Chief Justice was so proud of this new system, he assembled his entire bench in his chambers for a demonstration. I first pulled up the calendar of the only woman on the high court in Dar. Her calendar was jammed, morning and afternoon sessions, 5 days a week, an impossible case load. Next, I pulled up the calendar for the senior male judge on the court. When his schedule appeared, I thought the software had malfunctioned. A straight line appeared down the middle of the screen. We all had the same stunned reaction as we realized he only held court on Wednesdays. It was the most vivid display of the power of automation I've ever seen. The Chief Justice looked at the judge with the light schedule sternly and said, "I now see why my lady is so fatigued. She will be fatigued no longer." So now I want to step back to my life here, because one of the questions when I started writing this was, well, why did you have the audacity to think you knew about these things? What experiences did you have in the United States that made you something of an expert? So I After law school, I came back to Raleigh to clerk for Frank Dupree, the venerable and veteran district judge here in Raleigh, for a 2-year clerkship. My clerkship with Judge Dupree turned out to be quite different than expected. All of my friends from Yale, which is where I went to law school, had taken clerkships with federal judges in New York, Los Angeles, and Washington. There, I assumed they would be in the midst of crucial cases, making national headlines. On the other hand, I was returning to Eastern North Carolina to watch trials of car wrecks and bank robberies. But that was not to be. At that time, the largest patent and antitrust case in the country was pending in South Carolina. This was a lawsuit by virtually every textile manufacturer in the country against Deering-Milliken, challenging the patents on the machines from which polyester was spun. At issue was all of the polyester ever made. Every South Carolina federal judge, either because of their friendship with Roger Milliken or ownership of stock in his company, recused themselves. Consequently, the chief judge of the Fourth Circuit assigned the case to Judge Dupree for trial. And so he packed up his court apparatus, including myself and his other law clerk, and we headed down to South Carolina, where we commandeered the small vacant federal courthouse in Rock Hill. My co-clerk and I alternated weeks traveling there with him for trial. The case involved dozens of top-tier lawyers and numerous expert witnesses. It was hopelessly complex. I went to bed every night with drawings of textile machines, trying to understand how they worked. Judge Dupree quickly tired of hotel life in Rock Hill, and he rented a modest 2-bedroom apartment for us. Not afraid to pinch a penny, he enjoyed coming into town for grocery shopping every Sunday afternoon. On the weeks I accompanied him, he would try to spend less than he and my co-clerk had spent the Sunday before. Suffice it to say, we ate simply. The lengthy trial finally reached closing arguments. Simon Rifkin, the highest paid civil attorney in the country, Paul Weiss Rifkin, was making his pitch. Judge Dupree looked over and got my attention. He held up his hand for Rifkin to pause, and he motioned for me to come to the bench. I leaned my ear close as he whispered, "You better run back home. I don't think I put enough water in the crock pot with those black-eyed peas. You better go check them before we burn the place down." I raced out of the courtroom, drove his enormous Carolina Blue Mercury back to the apartment and added water. Disaster averted, I stepped back into the courtroom where closing arguments were in progress and flashed a big okay. To this day, lawyers have asked me what this was about. And during his lifetime, I never told them because they were all convinced that he had sent me running off to research an obscure legal point that was pivotal in his decision to award the plaintiffs $40 million in damages. So, I don't want to run. Tell me when we're running out of time, Gene. Okay, all right. Yeah, I'll be glad to. Well, let me go then. The peas were great, and we had a lot of them. It was his favorite dish. You can go a long way on a bag of dried black-eyed peas. So let me move forward. I worked at the district court for 13 years, both as the clerk of court and the federal magistrate judge, and then a vacancy came open on the federal bankruptcy court, where I moved for 21 years. And the bankruptcy courts have huge dockets and process thousands of orders daily. Many of these are routine, but I asked to see everything issued in my name until I fully understood what was going on. I was often at the courthouse until midnight, going through stacks of motions and proposed orders. One night, as I was nearing the end of a stack, I found someone had slipped a sheet of legal paper into the pile and anonymously written, "You should resign." My first impulse was to ignore it, but after a worried and sleepless night, I showed it to my able clerk of court. She was horrified, and she promised to get to the bottom of it. She returned a few minutes later, laughing so hard she could not catch her breath. It says, "Re-sign," she explained. "The copier ate the orders below this yesterday, and you have to sign them again." So let me, I had some real adventures on that continent, and I could tell you about a lot of them, but you can also get the book and read about it yourself. But let me tell you one that was really quite something. My co-clerk, when I worked with Frank Dupree, was John Edwards. He was from Robbins, I was from Welcome. Nobody in either of our families had ever gone to college, and we became bosom buddies and have stayed friends to this day. And so when I was in Africa at one point, and I had my oldest son, Matt, with me, and I suggested to John, why don't you bring Wade over and we'll do the big walk. The big walk is climbing Kilimanjaro. The trip almost came unglued at several points. Wade's mother, Elizabeth, was so concerned about his conditioning, she sent him to Outward Bound in the Rocky Mountains to train. He arrived with such blisters on his feet he could barely walk. Our terrific guide, John Matui, called him "boy with sick feet." The first day was rough going, but we figured out that if Wade and I traded hiking boots, my larger ones wouldn't rub so badly. The second day, my ever-polite son forgot the rules and took a slug of water from one of the porter's jugs. By nightfall, his intestinal system was trash as diarrhea hit, and he was convulsively throwing up. I woke John in the middle of the night and said we had to go back down, but he and Wade should continue. But by morning, Matt said he was feeling better and he refused to quit. We had a couple of days of pleasant climbing. At about 17,000 feet, John and I turned to each other simultaneously and said, "My head is splitting." The altitude sickness we feared had hit with a vengeance. The prescription diuretics gave me some relief, but not John. He got progressively worse. The night before we were to start for the summit, it was assumed I would go with the boys and he would rest in the tent. But if you know John, when it was time to depart, there he was in his cold weather climbing clothes. He was going with us. He lasted about 2 hours when his labored pace slowed us down so much that the boys were freezing. John and I sat on a rock and I said, "What do you want here?" "I want Wade to get to the top," he said. "Then you've got to go back down and let us go up, or none of us are going to make it," I said. He saw the truth and agreed. I climbed with the two boys through the night, saw the sun rise over the summit. It was the experience of a lifetime. About 2 hours into the climb down, we were stunned to see John with a single porter laboring up the mountain. He had not gone down at all. He had just waited on us to get out of sight. I could tell he was spent. I told the boys to go back to base camp with their guide and wait for us. Then I took one end of John's walking stick and his porter the other. He held on to the middle, and the three of us went back to the top. He said, "You don't have to do this." "I know, but if you think I'm going to leave you here to die on this mountain alone and go home and face Elizabeth, you really are hallucinating." So I'll stop there. The book, I hope people said you need to write these stories down, so I wrote them down. It's actually just in the last few weeks. I narrated it. It just went up on Audible, so it's easy to find and listen to. I'll stop right there. If I have a couple of minutes and anybody has a question, I'm glad to try to answer it. Cindy? I learned a lot of good lingo. When you try a case in Africa based on the English tradition, the lawyers will actually tie up their exhibits with string and hand them up to the court. They call it their bundle. And so when I'd get very frustrated with a case that had been inappropriately prepared here, I would say, the problem here is the bundles are out of order. The other thing I learned there are African time is very different from our time. Going up Kilimanjaro, for instance, we would ask John, morning, lunch, afternoon, John, how much further? We almost halfway. And that's become the answer to all of my children when they ask on a trip, how much further? And now they all say, even though they're teenagers, we know, Dad, we almost halfway. So lingo turned out to be really impressive.
I'm going to ask you if you'll stay just a minute or two afterwards, and maybe you can handle one or two more questions.
I can.
Okay.
You know, if anybody wants it, I got some books.
Thank you so much. We give a presentation to our speakers. We present a children's book to read and feed. We would love for you to sign this.
Yeah, I'd love to.
And read and feed, in case some people have forgotten or some new members might not know, their mission is to strengthen literacy skills among underserved elementary school children and provide meals in a nurturing neighborhood environment, which we're pleased to do. So
that's terrific.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming.
Oh, anytime.
Thank you. I want to thank our guests, Robert and Jimmy. We hope you'll come back and join the club. And now, one announcement I would like to make is we don't have a meeting next Thursday, so don't show up. And now, next Friday, I'm sorry, what was I thinking of? That's true. And I would like to have Charlie Sawyer come up, and he wants to share something with the membership.
I'd like to honor our friend and fellow Kiwanian, Don Suki, who passed away about a week and a half ago. When I asked his son what was the cause of death, he said 93. Don grew up in Iowa and was a manufacturer's rep for a vacuum packaging company in the meat industry. He became a member of our club when a fellow member, you may recall, who's also deceased, Steve Van Westendorp, invited him to come. Steve was a Navy captain of a ship in the Pacific, and I jokingly called him Captain Stevie, and he said, "No one ever addressed me that way." I said, "I don't work for you." Don attended the U.S. Naval Academy and also the University of Iowa, always a Hawkeye. Don played in the 1956 Rose Bowl, making the winning touchdown in the final seconds of the game, and for 1 week was the most valuable player in the U.S. Don was a fine man with admirable integrity and morals. As Don experienced increasing mobility issues, I had the honor of picking him up and bringing him to Kiwanis. These were trips filled with sharing valuable wisdom and knowledge about his life, as well as singing polka music and country music and the occasional joke, which doesn't need to be repeated here. Don looked forward to coming each week, sitting at his place in the corner of our table and kidding around with people. He loved people, and he enjoyed taking the leftover cakes from Meadows back to the employees at Abbotswood and Brighton Gardens. Don showed us that even with physical limitations, life is wonderful and worth looking forward to each day. God bless him. Let's stand for a moment of silence.